Corporate culture is formed through a set of interrelated and tightly connected components, including business philosophy and ethics, organizational rules and operating procedures, leadership style, employees' working styles, as well as the firm's product systems, production processes, and internal communication and interaction mechanisms. In addition, corporate culture is reflected in the way an enterprise builds and manages relationships with customers, business partners, and society at large. In other words, corporate culture represents the way an organization thinks and acts, developed over time and shared among its members. In practice, corporate culture does not exist merely in written documents, rather, it is clearly manifested in how a firm interacts with customers, competes in the marketplace, manages and treats its employees, and embodies the values and leadership style of its top management. Corporate culture is also expressed through employees' work attitudes, the organization's stance toward the natural environment, and its sense of social responsibility, thereby shaping the firm's identity and contributing to a sustainable competitive advantage. When new employees join an organization, they observe the behaviors and practices of more experienced colleagues, gradually learning and adapting accordingly. This process of observation and imitation plays a crucial role in maintaining and transmitting corporate culture over time. Corporate culture is fundamentally shaped by leadership, and leaders play a decisive role in defining and sustaining the cultural identity of the organization. Corporate culture reflects a shared consensus in perspectives and patterns of action within an organization, functioning as a common orientation that guides both managers and employees in how they should think and behave at work. First and foremost, corporate culture is closely linked to perception and cognition. Individuals recognize an organization's culture through what they observe, hear, and experience in their everyday working environment. Although organizational members differ in terms of education, position, and role, they are often able to describe corporate culture in similar ways, indicating a shared understanding of the organization. In addition, corporate culture is practical and behavior-oriented, as it directly influences how members make decisions and take action. It guides employees in applying shared philosophies, values, and norms, those that have been accepted and internalized by the organization, when handling specific tasks and relationships. Within this framework, business ethics constitutes an integral component of corporate culture. Ethics is not always explicitly articulated through words or formal documents, rather, it is often embedded in actions, behavioral patterns, speeches, and organizational communications. Even when a company does not explicitly refer to ethics, observers can still discern ethical dimensions in its decisions and conduct through the way it acts and communicates. Therefore, what truly matters is not the formal declaration of ethics, but the core values that the organization genuinely believes in and consistently practices in its daily operations. From a cultural perspective, in certain social contexts, obedience is regarded as a cultural norm, particularly in societies characterized by high power distance, where subordinates tend to listen to and comply with instructions from superiors. However, not all forms of obedience are ethically positive or appropriate. In some cases, compliance merely reflects a cultural norm and does not necessarily equate to ethical behavior. When obedience becomes mechanical and absolute, disregarding considerations of right and wrong and failing to question the legitimacy of orders, ethical issues are likely to arise. In many situations, compliance with orders may even constitute unethical conduct. For example, if a superior instructs a subordinate to steal a competitor's design ideas, the subordinate may comply out of fear of losing their job or being threatened, despite clearly recognizing that the action is wrong. In this case, the leader abuses authority to coerce compliance, while the subordinate's obedience, although consistent with cultural expectations, results in ethical violations. This illustrates that a culture of obedience, if not constrained by clear ethical standards, can pose serious ethical risks to an organization. Corporate culture has a direct influence on individual behavior. While personal values shape how individuals think and act, once individuals live and work within an organization, their behavior is often strongly influenced by the organization's culture. In many cases, Individual behavior does not merely reflect personal character or values, but rather emerges from the interaction between personal values and corporate culture. Therefore, behavior within an organization cannot be fully explained by individual characteristics alone. It must be understood in relation to the organizational cultural context in which the individual operates. For example, when an employee becomes aware that their company is engaging in wrongful practices such as selling products of unclear origin, failing to ensure quality, or endangering consumer health, they may clearly recognize such actions as deceptive and unethical. In practice, however, many employees choose to remain silent. This silence may stem from the prevailing corporate culture, in which employees fear negative consequences for speaking up, such as job loss, social exclusion, or other adverse repercussions for themselves or the organization. This illustrates that corporate culture can either encourage or suppress ethical behavior, thereby exerting a profound influence on how individuals act within the workplace. In practice, the law cannot comprehensively regulate or provide guidance for every ethical situation that enterprises may encounter, as discussed in Chapter 1 regarding the limitations of legal systems. There are decisions that do not violate the law yet still raise questions of right versus wrong or ought versus ought not from an ethical perspective. In such cases, corporate culture becomes a critical guiding factor in the decision-making process. Corporate culture can be understood as the aggregate of values, norms, and implicit rules that are developed and sustained within an organization. These rules are not necessarily codified in formal legal documents, yet they exert a powerful influence on members' behavior. Through corporate culture, organizations encourage, recognize, and reinforce patterns of decision-making that align with shared values, while discouraging or constraining decisions that may cause harm to individuals, society, or the organization's reputation. In this sense, corporate culture functions as a moral compass, guiding individuals toward ethical behavior when legal guidance is insufficient. An ethical culture is a form of corporate culture that places human beings at its center, meaning that in all activities and decisions, enterprises prioritize the protection of people and humanistic values. Within the organization, an ethical culture is reflected in the respect for employees, the protection of their rights, and the expectation that they are both permitted and encouraged to act ethically. This responsibility is not limited to relationships among employees or between superiors and subordinates, but also extends to the impact of employees' behavior on external stakeholders. For example, sales staff in an organization with a strong ethical culture are expected to act with honesty and fairness, safeguard customers' interests, provide accurate information, and fulfill promotional commitments in full. By contrast, in organizations that place less emphasis on ethical culture, values such as revenue and profit may be prioritized over how results are achieved. In such contexts, employees may come to believe that sales performance is the sole measure of success, while customer satisfaction and ethical conduct are treated as secondary. Performance pressure can lead individuals to overlook considerations of right and wrong, engage in opportunistic behavior, distort information, or conceal facts in order to meet targets. This explains why society increasingly emphasizes the need to reduce performance obsession, as celebrating outcomes without regard to the means by which they are achieved creates fertile ground for ethical problems. A firm's ethical culture is the combined outcome of multiple factors, including corporate policies, leadership roles in ethical matters, peer influence, the degree of employee empowerment, internal communication, and, most critically, the availability of opportunities for unethical behavior. When control systems are weak and supervision and sanctions are insufficient, organizations may unintentionally facilitate unethical conduct. Therefore, building an ethical culture requires enterprises to address values, people, and management systems simultaneously, rather than relying solely on symbolic slogans or formal statements.